to Pennsylvania in 1995 from York. He is a doctor at the Pennsylvania Department of Health, where he works on disease outbreak investigations. For the past 19 years, he has lived in the mountains a very short distance from Pine Grove State Park and is the chairman of the Friends of the Park. His special interest is the industrial archaeology of iron making at Pine Grove and the people who owned the work at the ironworks in South Mountains. He has written several articles for Cumberland County history, as well as a number of handouts for use during his frequent public tours of the furnace and the Ironmaster's mansion in the state park. In 2016, Andre joined the Board of Trustees of the Cumberland County Historical Society. I am very happy and proud to introduce Andre.
Thank you, Linda. I came here from New York City, so I've become a reformed country boy. Really living out in the middle of nowhere now. My wife Diane is here. We live just a 10-minute drive from the state park up on top of the mountain and truly in the middle of nowhere. So the topic this afternoon is the park before the park, by which I mean that before the modern state park, there was a very different sort of rustic experience that you could have in that area. I have to give a few minutes of prologue or background to set the stage for this. So let's start with Jay Cooke, who once upon a time was a household name in the same way that Warren Buffett or Bill Gates would be today. Jay Cooke was known nationally as the financier of the Civil War. He, for a while, was the richest man in America. And towards the end of the Civil War, he branched out of the banking and finance sphere to buy some iron operations, a couple of them in New York State, and he bought Pine Grove Furnace, as well as he went into insurance and a few other non-banking activities. But for our purposes, the thing is that in 1864, Jay Cooke bought Pine Grove Furnace, or Pine Grove Iron Works more technically, created the South Mountain Iron Company. He was sort of a shadow partner, but he was very much his business. It was a stock venture. And the company built the South Mountain Railroad, which was built 68 to 69 and really came into full operation at the start of 1870. And it's an important part of the story. That's why I mentioned the railroad. In 1871, the company brought in a new superintendent, a gentleman named Jackson Fuller, originally from Massachusetts. And Jackson Fuller had been involved in iron and coal industry in eastern Pennsylvania. So he was a good choice. The iron industry had its ups and downs after the Civil War, in particular this kind of charcoal, almost artisanal sort of iron making process. Because of problems in the financial world, Jay Cooke in November of '72 had to sell the company, and less than a year later culminated in the Panic of 1873 that was blamed very much on Jay Cooke. It was really an international depression. The furnace went out of business. It was both out of business and out of iron making. It went out of blast for about 4 years. Jay Cooke regained some of his wealth, repurchased the iron works at Pine Grove. He had a personal interest in it. He never lived there, but he visited regularly. And they formed another joint stock venture. This time, Jay Cooke was clearly one of the stockholders, and now Jackson Fuller is an owner, not a superintendent. They brought in other men to be the superintendent. When they repurchased it, they spent a fair bit of money and time to completely rehaul the furnace, to redo the operation in the winter of 1877, 1878. And I tell you all of this because, thanks Linda, because it's really amazing that they did so. The iron industry had shifted to steel making, had shifted to very large scale operations elsewhere with much better transportation networks. And so it's, I don't want to say foolish, but I guess I could say it, knowing what happened over the next 20 years, they managed to keep the business going, but they had a struggle. So in that context, they still went ahead and upgraded the furnace, but at the same time, Jackson Fuller was no fool. He looked for other uses of the 20,000+ acres of mountain land and the various mineral and lumber resources they had. So one of the things that Jackson Fuller came up with was the amusement park, and that's our topic today. But I just want to very briefly mention the other big ones, the natural ice industry and brick making. When I do my frequent summertime talks and tours at Pine Grove Furnace, I frequently hear from people that they know about the natural ice industry, which started in the 1880s, so this is around the same time. They may know that the pole steeple hiking parking lot at the back of Laurel Lake is where one of the ice barns was. They maybe have seen pictures of ice harvest, and there's even some street names back there, Ice House, ice cutters, etc. So it's a familiar idea that there was an ice industry. And if nothing else, people know about the bricks because there's a day use area in the modern state park called Brickyard Day Use Area. And there's a lot of bricks in the ground and the grass there if you look for them. So people generally know about the ice industry and the bricks, but the amusement park is a story that most people just haven't heard. And that's something I like to change, not only through talks like this, but someday I'd like to get a kiosk, a wayside display to let people know, because you go right through this and you have no idea it was there. So, the amusement park, and I'm going to be talking quite a bit this afternoon about this 1881 poster. You'll be seeing it repeatedly, and one of the handouts in the back is an enlargement of the engravings so that you can study them on your own. So, why did Jackson Fuller do this? Well, here we have some memoirs from Horace Andrew Kiefer, who was the last superintendent of Pine Grove Furnace. And what he remembered, writing some 20 years later, after the furnace was out of blast, what he remembered was the railroad was the weakest part of our system. Not enough business could be supplied locally to balance the expenditures. We laid out a park a half mile, it's actually east of the furnace, dammed up Mountain Creek for a lake, put in a number of attractions, and erected rustic buildings. With these diversions, we had through the summer season daily 4 to 10 coach loads of Sunday school and other organizations with picnics. So the railroad is really the reason for the park. It's not that Jackson Fuller wanted to become, what we would today recognize as Walt Disney, that kind of approach. He didn't want to run an amusement park, he wanted to make money for the railroad. And the way to do that was to increase paying passengers. The way to do that was to give the paying passengers something to go visit. So the deal was that they had the railroad running right past the spot they picked for the park. Here's a map from, I guess it's 1895, railroad map of the county, and zooming into what at that point had switched from the South Mountain to become the Hunters Run and Slate Belt Railroad. And sure enough, on this map, Pine Grove Park has its own station, just a place for the train to stop, sandwiched in between Laurel Forge, and the end of the line at that point was Pine Grove Furnace itself. The park was free, so that's a little hard to understand. You go to Disneyland today, you pay quite a lot of money to get your e-tickets and go in, right? Well, again, the idea was the paying passengers, the tickets were essentially a bundle. You bought your ticket, you were allowed to then go to the park for free. There were about 30 acres that they remember at the time. 30 acres were laid out with multiple buildings, attractions, and activities. And I've colored in this map from the chief engineer of the South Mountain Railroad to show you where the park was. It's off on the east side on the right there. And I do want to just point out something important. So I've told you that they were upgrading the furnace and it was making iron for most of the time that the park was operating. So the furnace is over here. You've got an active iron quarry operation here that's now Fuller Lake. But at the time it was being pumped dry so they could continue to get iron out of it. Those are really loud, noxious activities. And so it's amazing that they were getting people to come into the mountains to go to a rustic, sylvan glade, only about 6/10 of a mile from the furnace, and even closer to Fuller Lake. And I think part of the reason they picked the spot they did is that there's a ridge of elevated land here, and today there's a state park water tower right on the top of it because it's one of the highest points in this immediate area. So you had a barrier, a topographic barrier between the industrial operation and the wooded area where the park was. And that was clearly very important. I hope it kept the sound from transmitting because there were steam engines and banging and noises constantly going on at the furnace. And in the other direction, about 1.5 miles on the other side, you've got Laurel Forge, which would have been extremely loud. And I certainly hope that, at least we have no descriptions from back then, that people could hear the forge in operation from 1.5 miles away. I hope that the trees were protecting it. So it's really sandwiched in between two noxious environments. The park, those 30 acres shown on a modern map, just to highlight that it's close to the ore pit, and there's Laurel Forge. And if you've ever visited Pine Grove Furnace State Park and gone for a walk on the Copenhagen Loop Trail, which leads off of the Fuller Lake area, off of Fuller Field, you've walked right through the middle of where all of what I'm talking about today was located. And there's no indication. There's just a few things that if you know to look for them and what they are, I'd like to change that. I'd like to get a sign in there or something so people know what they're passing through. So it's an awful lot of history. So it was created in 1878. In the spring, they started working on it, apparently. It may have been in operation in 78. It was certainly in full swing by 1879. And by 1880, they had well over 21,000 visitors a year. Almost all of those people were coming in on the train. Each one of them is paying their 50 cents or whatever it was at different times. So that's where the money was, with those 20,000+ people coming in on the train. The entrance, as I said, was free to the excursionists, and in the back of the room I've reproduced this actual ticket. It's both an advertisement and a ticket, and the copy that I found years and years ago, I wish I knew the source on the internet, has on the back of it penciled in the name of the family that used the ticket. So that's an actual used ticket that would get you to the park. There was a free public kitchen. In the promotional literature, they said when you arrived, there was a kitchen, boiling water would be ready for each train load, so you could make tea or coffee, and I guess in those days you probably brought bouillon cubes. Nowadays you'd want to have a grill so you could stick your burgers on and your hot dogs. Different kind of picnicking going on, I guess, back in the late 19th century. They always talked about the many pavilions and other structures in case it rained, so that people didn't have to worry about being caught in a thunderstorm or whatever. But in particular, they always highlighted a 60-foot long pavilion, and I'll be talking about that repeatedly this afternoon. That 60 by 30-foot pavilion was originally intended for dancing, but of course could be used for almost anything else. If you didn't want to bring your own picnic, you could have a restaurant meal. So this was both a restaurant and dining room run by the Mansion House of Carlisle, so right up the street here. Mr. B.S. Wilder, proprietor of the Mansion House. Everything is under the direct supervision and will spare no efforts to please all who patronize them. Obviously, that's a meal that you'd have to pay for, not covered by your railroad ticket. And the promotional literature also always mentioned that there was a log cabin for ladies' toilet rooms. I don't know what the gentlemen were supposed to do. I guess there are trees and you can go behind a tree. They never mentioned the gentlemen, only the ladies. So you get out there, you're in the forest, what can you do? Well, as it says on your little ticket, you can have boating. There was a 2-acre lake, I'll describe that in a minute. It's actually just part of Mountain Creek, pretty small. You could go fishing, you could ride the flying horses. What's that? That's a carousel, or what we probably call today a merry-go-round. Kind of interchangeable almost terms. There was bowling, what they called 10 pins, and there was either 1 or 2 alleys depending on when you read the documentation. After a few years of operation, they put in a bicycle racetrack, which was apparently made of wood. We don't know too much about it. There was a rifle shooting range, which is described variously as 100 or 200 yards. Obviously, you could have both at the same time, or maybe they changed the distance through the years. That was located on the south side of the railroad tracks, so I guess they'd be facing into the hillside to the south and not pointing towards the amusement park. And in fact, I'll bring this up in a few minutes, there were lots of humorous comments about shots going wild and landing in Adams County, so going, I guess, over the hill. So they must have been pointing to the south away from the amusement park. There was a baseball playing field which was described as being right next to the train stop. However, there's very little land there. It must have been a rather narrow, long ball playing field. There was dancing and music, which was a popular feature. Sometimes the bands would come with the picnickers or other social groups, from Carlisle or from wherever. In 1882, Jackson Fuller created a brass band, and he paid several $100 for the instruments. And then in 1890, they installed an orchestrion. I don't know anything much about the specific device they had there, but an orchestrion is a mechanical music-making gizmo. So you could do all of these things. Now, the flying horses is really intriguing, and for reasons that will become obvious in a few minutes, I'm going to show you a sketch, but not a photograph of it. It had to be described in an 1880 newspaper. It says, don't start, gentle reader. And they go on to tell you who made it, which is really great detail. And by the way, some of these newspaper articles I'm showing you were found just in the last few months by several people, in particular Richard Tritt and Randy Watts helped out a lot after I gave that talk back in October. A huge amount of material has emerged through the efforts of several people, certainly not just myself. And I think, Richard, I think you were the one who found this. So this is wonderful. It says the flying horses or carousel came from C.W. Dare, maker of New York. So it turns out that Charles W.F. Dare, New York Carousel Company, was one of the prominent makers of these devices, and they were in operation from just after the Civil War up until 1901, actually about the time this Pine Grove Park stopped operating. They made carousels, they made 10-pin alleys, so we don't know, but maybe they also installed a bowling alley there. Ferris wheels, which we did not have one at Pine Grove Park, it's too bad, and swings. And they talk about patent swings and the idea that the swings were safe. So there must have been some popular understanding that children could get hurt, which is still true today. So that's a very interesting and fairly new piece of information, who made the carousel. There's something else that's very strange, though. This article says that the carousel flying horses is placed in a rustic building which reflects credit upon Mr. Birkenbein, who superintended its erection. Now, John Birkenbein was the engineer who was brought in 1877 to upgrade the furnace. And he became an internationally known consultant in the mining and hydraulic industry. And John Birkenbein remained associated with Pine Grove Furnace for the next several decades, but it was far from the only thing that he worked on. He is not a civil engineer. He is not the guy you would normally think of putting up a building. So the question is, why in the world did they mention that Birkenbein superintended the building for the flying horses? And the answer comes from some other documentation that mentions that this was powered by water. We don't know the details. I would love to find a sketch or an understanding of this, but they must have had a little side channel off of Mountain Creek and some kind of turbine or just a water wheel or something hidden away. And that's how it spun. And that has to be why John Birkenbein was involved. Okay, so the other thing that the newspaper from 1880 tells us is that the places you ride are fixed in arc style, 2 of a kind. So there's 2 elephants, 2 deers, plural, 4 large and 8 small horses, and 4 coaches, I guess, if you don't want to ride on top of one of these other animals. Very intriguing. The pictures on the sides are irresistibly funny. Don't tell us what the pictures were actually of. It's very frustrating. It turns out, now the carousel at Pine Grove Park is long gone. We have no other descriptions of it. It turns out there are still 2 of these setups that were made by the Charles Dare Company, still in existence. Thanks to the internet, you're able to see pictures of them and everything. One of them is in Rhode Island, the Flying Horses of Watch Hill. And here's another image, and you can see that in the back there is all kinds of drawings, paintings, and these at least are not funny. And there's a mechanical thing that I guess is kind of like an orchestrion. And there's also one of these surviving in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, the Flying Horses of Oak Bluffs. And the curious thing is that the Charles Dare arrangement in Rhode Island is literally flying, so they're on chains, and as the thing spins, you're gonna go out sideways. That must have been quite a ride. That's the idea that you grab the brass ring and all that, which apparently they did have a brass ring at Pine Grove Park. The one in Martha's Vineyard, at least as it's set up now, seems to have a rigid arrangement with poles, so that what you tend to see today in more modern ones is you're not swinging out, you're fixed in position as you go around and around. So we can only use our imaginations as to what the setup at Pine Grove Park was like, but it must have been similar to these 2, which were made just a few years after the one was installed at Pine Grove Park. The bowling alley, perhaps made by the Dare Company, I don't know. In this sketch, we can see the ball return in the middle, and it looks like there's space for 2 bowlers on either side. And that rather curious lake, as they called it. Now, we're not talking about Laurel Lake or Fuller Lake of today's park. This was made by putting a little dam across Mountain Creek, which is really not all that wide, and allowing it to back up. And they say specifically it was 2 acres and not over 2 feet deep, so it was perfectly safe for children. I've looked at the channel there and the topography, and this must have been an extremely narrow, long lake. So a little bit of promotional literature there to say there's a lake that you can go boating on. I think you can paddle once, twice, and hit both sides real quick. And the baseball playing field. And this is a theme we're going to come up with again about baseball later in the hour. So here's an image of the railroad track. So this is coming from Laurel, stops, and then carries on to the end of the line at Fuller, past Fuller Lake to the furnace. And there's a little platform there. And there are people watching and then playing. Although I got to say that there's one gentleman, I think think this is the guy. He's holding something horizontally. And the first time I looked at this particular drawing, I thought he was shooting, which made no sense because he'd be shooting at the lake. And then I realized that it's a rather crudely drawn baseball. So that's what we're seeing there. And the rifle shooting range, I wish I knew exactly where it was, because you can imagine the backstop must have bullets all over the ground, probably underneath 6 inches of soil today. But they had prizes, and it was a very popular activity. And one of the groups that came there and had shooting contests that were frequently discussed in the newspaper were the Gobbin Guards, who were a kind of ceremonial dress and drill unit from Carlisle. I don't know the origin of the name Gobbin. I've been trying to find that. Richard, do you have any idea? G-O-B-I-N. It's a very strange name. The Gobbin Guards.
Sir?
Anyone know?
It's Gobin.
Gobin. Okay, thank you. And the Gobin, what does Gobin mean?
I don't know.
Ah, you only got me halfway there. No, thank you. Gobin Guards. Very good.
They're still in existence.
Really?
It's a family name in Carlisle.
Okay, so they're still in existence. After the talk, will you please give me some information so I can communicate with them? I'd love to know more history in connection with their frequent outings to Pine Grove Park. In fact, they went, it seems, repeatedly. It was always a big July thing, and they would have many hundreds of people. In fact, this 1880 article from the Carlisle newspaper says they had 800 to 1,000 people. That's a lot in 30 acres. And in fact, there was a church picnic around this time that 2 different newspapers said had as many as 3,000 people, which I find hard to believe. That's a lot of people for this fairly small area. They would bring special trains, so they would have multiple passenger cars dedicated to running folks from Harrisburg and Carlisle and come down to Pine Grove Park. As the newspaper says, the young folks occupied the time in dancing, taking strolls through the shady nooks, etc., and eating. And that's still true today. You go on a picnic, you eat way too much. The Carlisle band accompanied the guards in their attractive uniforms. Gobin. Okay, that's great. So they had shooting contests, which were a source of much amusement. And if you go back and through several years of newspaper articles, their July picnic, they described in enormous detail who shot, exactly their score, the idea that the gentlemen who were down at the target would just kind of have to die for their lives, because there'd be someone holding up a little flag to tell you where the bullet went, and sometimes the bullets, went wild and landed in Adams County and so forth. Another aspect of this park, no alcohol and no gambling. And I find this interesting because of the times in the late 19th century, and also because Jay Cook personally was abstemious. Jay Cook was a very religious man. I don't know about Jackson Fuller, but I bet he had a similar attitude towards things. And it says here, at least in public, it says the desire of President Fuller was that people should enjoy themselves without expense or extortion. To this end, no games of chance are tolerated. The sale of intoxicating liquors is rigidly prohibited. And an 1881 promotional book, which I have a reprint of, it's kind of interesting, and I did photocopy the pages as one of your handouts about Pine Grove Park. So the Cumberland Valley Railroad booklet says, no intoxicating drinks of any character are allowed. There is no place within 6 miles where liquor can be obtained. And the reason they're able to say that is because all of the land surrounding Pine Grove Park is part of the iron lands, the forests that were used to make charcoal to fuel the furnace. So they owned everything for quite a distance around. The iron company owned well over 20,000 acres. So they could say that the management can effectively prevent its sale or the annoyance of the visitors by outside parties. However, it apparently did happen because in 1879, so they had just opened, it was a very new park. They'd opened the year before, really. Their first true season, their first busy season, 2 guys are arrested. And think about this. They were selling whiskey and playing 3-card Monte. They weren't just escorted off the premises, sent back wherever they came from. They were actually arrested. And I find that kind of curious. They were sent to jail, yeah. However, it's always an issue up there in the mountains. This is from 1886, a few years later. I don't know if this is actually related to Pine Grove Park, but it just gives you a sense that there was moonshining going on in those hills. So, if you came out to the park and you didn't want to ride in the carousel, or if you were a gentleman, it was probably unseemly, and you got tired of walking around, and you couldn't gamble and you couldn't drink, what else could you do? Well, you could learn the mysteries of iron manufacture. So one of the curious things is several different connections in different ways between Pine Grove Furnace and the Great Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition of 1876. And that's perhaps a topic for an article sometime, both on the industrial side, and then here we have an interesting connection. So after the Philadelphia Centennial, the international exhibition to promote U.S. industry and so forth. There was a self-contained Baldwin steam car. So this is sort of a locomotive and a passenger vehicle all in one unit. And it used to go up and down Market Street in Philadelphia, running festival attendees back and forth. They purchased it, and they did this actually in 1878 when they were first setting up this Pine Grove Park. And it was standard gauge, so they could put it on the railroad tracks that ran past, and you would have the people visiting the park pay a little extra. Of course, it's all about money. They could pay their dime, and they could ride up to see the iron furnace, which was in operation. They just upgraded it. It was producing thousands of tons of pig iron in that period. It was its busiest, happiest time, yet it was still outcompeted. I guess they did not have personal injury lawyers the way we do now, because this is very dangerous stuff. You've got molten iron at almost 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You've got steam engines. There's heavy, sharp things around. You've got the workers doing their stuff. And you've got picnickers coming up on this little steam car, the little Baldwin, and looking around. I don't know if they had handrails. You go on a factory tour today, and you've got plexiglass and railings and safety, and there was none of that at the time. You could also, in later years, take the slate belt extension that ran up Piney Mountain Ridge, and that kind of took off where the Fuller Lake Beach is today, and that would lead you up and over the mountain towards the slate quarry up there near Adams County. And that extension was said to have really pretty views over the mountainsides, and if you walk where it used to be, you can certainly believe that. So that was another way to get money. You could pay to ride the Baldwin to the furnace, you could pay to ride the railroad cars up and over the mountain, all of it bringing in extra income. So I should pause here to just point out that Jackson Fuller didn't come up with this on his own. He was not the first one to do this by a long shot, even in this region. Monalto Park had set up something very similar to all of this in 1875, so that's 3 years before Jackson Fuller, and you can imagine he probably got the idea from them. There was a kind of friendly competition between Monalto and Pine Grove through the years. So they had a park there, and if you go to the modern, very small state park at Monalto, you'll probably recognize this. It's now a picnic area, a little picnic pavilion, but this is where the flying horses or the carousel was at the Monalto Park. And I point out to you the shape of that interesting roof, because you'll see that repeatedly through these kinds of structures. So they had one there. They even had a shooting gallery, although if this advertisement's to be believed, it was a very short-range one. I don't know if it's really accurate, but that's how they sketched it. So you can imagine Jackson Fuller saying, ours is 200 yards, Who knows if they actually said that. There were others in the area. Many people know there was a trolley park in the very early 20th century at Boiling Springs. But prior to that, actually also around 1875, there was the Island Grove Park, very close to Boiling Springs Children's Lake area. So Island Grove had a park around the same time, very similar arrangement. And I can't remember where I found this picture online. I don't give credit to it. But again, one of those very steep roofs for what seems to be the Island Grove flying horses. And there were other uses of other iron company lands down in Caledonia. Well into the 19th century, there was the Grafenberg Inn, so there was rural excursion and entertainment, although they didn't have a rail service there until the early 20th century. I think it was 1903 that the Chambersburg trolley was extended there. So it became a trolley park in later years. So this idea of going out into the countryside to get away from the cities was part of a movement to perhaps balance some of the ills of urbanization and the second wave of the Industrial Revolution. And the idea that the public could go out into parks was fairly new in the late 19th century. And so Pine Grove Park is part of that. And of course, just after Pine Grove Park closed, one of the ones that's perhaps best known is Mount Holly, which opened 1901. That's where the Mount Holly Marsh Preserve hiking trails are now. Just past the Deer Lodge is where all of this was, in the gap there. So there were a bunch of these in the region. Going back to Pine Grove Park, what did it look like? Well, the first thing we could do is see if there was any promotional literature by the park itself, by Jackson Fuller and crew. Unfortunately, in the reprint, the only thing they have, they don't even give you a map of the place. The only thing they have is this utterly useless little happy sketch of people apparently playing in the dirt. I mean, it tells you nothing. It's obviously a generic image. So that doesn't help us. What about photographs? Well, the newspaper even says that J.N. Choate, the famous Carlisle photographer, had gone out there, and John Nicholas Choate apparently took pictures because the newspaper says, and we do have a few of them. He took the Gobin guards and a number of views of the park, but where are they? So what is mostly present in the photo archives here at the Society are pictures of this type. They're social groups, they're church groups, they're others. These ladies are dressed in heavy Victorian clothing, and none of them is smiling, which is of course typical. And if you take a look on the Society's Facebook page, there's a wonderful little blog post about the reason, this was just posted a few days ago, the reason that people don't smile in 19th century pictures. It's a very interesting discussion. But anyhow, what I'm interested in is not so much the folks in these pictures in the front, but I want to see what's in the back. So there's a structure there, I can't tell. Could that be the roof of the Flying Horses, or is it just the end of a pavilion? I'm really not sure. You can even glean some information from pictures like this about the trees. You know, how old are they, what kinds of trees? So there's some interesting information, but not quite what I'd like. The photo archives here did have, as far as I can tell, only 2 pictures that really show the infrastructure of the park. And this one is really nice. It shows you a footbridge across Mountain Creek. It shows you the edge of one of the pavilions. Maybe there's a second one back there. And you can see there's a flat area on the far left. That would appear to be the baseball playing field. So that's kind of nice. And even better, this is a wonderful image. It shows the dam that creates that little 2-acre, 2-foot lake. Okay, and this gentleman is standing in front of a boat. And you can see the dam is not very high, which makes sense because it's only supposed to be 2 feet deep so that you don't get drowned children. Very frustrating though. We don't have a map to tell us where things are. We don't have many photographs. At this point, as I was trying to understand Pine Grove Park, I turned to the poster, which when he came in was in the back of the room. And I've got it here. So this is from 1881. This is a reproduction that you can go buy around the corner at History on High. I hope that as soon as you leave this room, you'll rush over there and buy them. It's a very nice poster, and I'm really appreciative that it was reprinted, I guess, in conjunction with the 2012 special exhibit on Pine Grove. But there are still some for sale around the corner. And if you look closely at the poster, there are 3 engravings. And it's easy to just glance at them and not pay much attention. But what I'd like to do now is go into some detail, because I think that we actually have some accurate reproductions of what was on the ground. So the top one, the round one, has kind of clip art, we might call it today. Not very helpful. That's obviously generic nonsense about picnicking in the mansion house of Carlisle. But in the back, you have the dam. And you can see it's a little exaggerated. The height of the dam seems to be much more than it really was. There's people in a boat, and back here we have a train, which fits the layout that must have been at Pine Grove Park. And this train is heading out towards the end of the line at the furnace. I'm going to superimpose that photograph of the dam. And I know in the back of the room you have to crane your head a little bit, it's at the bottom there, but look, we've got this kind of thicker and thinner part, just like that. You can see that you were meant to walk across it, so it was a footbridge as well as a dam. That's what we see here. All of this suggests to me that whoever did these engravings either visited Pine Grove Park or had access to a number of photographs. Because taking into account artistic license and the promotional nature of the poster, these appear to be accurate sketches of what was actually there. Looking at the larger image on the right bottom of the poster, we have a layout that seems to fit what we think we know about it. Here's Mountain Creek running through. There's the little dam, several footbridges. There's one back here, I think. On the left side, we have the dam again. And people here, it's got a handrail, people walking across it, and those little boats in the 2-foot lake. You can see some structures in the back. And on the right side, we have, I showed you this earlier, we have the train stop and people playing baseball. Although I have to think that if you hit that hard, it landed in Mountain Creek. I mean, there's just not a lot of room there. It's not even as big as Fuller Field at the modern state park, if you know that. It's much narrower than that. So that's consistent with the layout. They could have just put a picture of people playing baseball, but instead they've got in this poster a really accurate depiction, I think. And then the third image on the 1881 poster shows us on the left side, I showed you this earlier, the ball return for bowling. You've got a log house here, and I don't know for sure what that was, but the promotional literature said there was a log structure for ladies' toilets. Maybe that's what that was. Or it could be something associated with mansion house kitchen, I don't know. In this particular image, there are several pavilions, and we've got the flying horses. And if you look at it closely, they're going counterclockwise, which is appropriate for an American flying horses. And you've got a swing set right next to it. Don't know, though, today where this was. That's killing me that we don't know. And kind of just thrown in, I guess, to balance the composition, you've got a rather roughly drawn woman. And what's interesting is, forget about not smiling, she's unhappy. If you look at her, whoops, sorry. If you look very closely, here, look at her, she's got a frown. And her head is down, and I don't know why the artist did that. So, all of this begs the question, who was the artist? If you look very, 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 very closely, it's tiny, okay? It's all the way down at the bottom, right there. I've enlarged it for you. It says Longacre, Longacre. It's very clear when you look at the original. So the artist did sign this. To my enormous frustration, however, the artist did not leave a first name or at least an initial. So now we've got an artist named Longacre, and that begs the question, who was Longacre? What I'm about to say is speculation. I think there's got to be a way to answer this by going probably to Philadelphia and working with the art museum and institutes there, and maybe even the Pennsylvania Historical Society. Somebody's got to have some information to confirm what I'm about to say. But it turns out the Longacre family was pretty prominent. They were based in Philadelphia and New York City. And the Longacres included several generations of reasonably well-known artists who tended to work in engravings and miniatures. That fits the style of this poster, doesn't it? The family included a prominent Methodist minister. And when I saw that, I said, aha, I know something that could connect them, because J. Cook was a very religious man. He's a Methodist. He built the 1870 brick chapel that's still in service today at Pine Grove Furnace, Methodist Episcopal Chapel. So, was there any connection between J. Cook, who lived in Philadelphia, who was of course extremely prominent, and the Longacre family? And it appears yes, because I can at least show that some decades before Pine Grove Park, there was a connection between J. Cook and, I'll say, the paterfamilias of the Longacres. This is circumstantial evidence only, but it is, I think, very suggestive. And perhaps there's a different Longacre, but I think this is the connection between the poster and Pine Grove Park, the artist there. Here's a table of contents for the American Sunday School Union back in the 1850s. So this is several decades before the park, but I just want to say that here's J. Cook mentioned, and here's James Barton Longacre mentioned. They traveled in the same social circles. They almost certainly must have known each other. So James Barton Longacre cannot be the artist, however, because he died 15 plus years too early. He was the chief engraver at the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia, extremely well known, and he's the guy who designed the Indian head penny, for example. And there's a story that's apparently not true, that one of his daughters was the image used on the Indian head penny. So James Longacre is an artist, and he has several descendants who are artists. And at least now we're into years where one of these people could have been the artist for this poster in 1881. His son, Andrew, was a prominent minister, but also known for his engravings and watercolorings. His grandson, James Longacre Wood, was a fairly skilled genre artist and portrait artist. And this is a stretch, but his granddaughter, so James Barton had a granddaughter named Lydia, and Lydia would have been only 11 years old when this poster was made. So this is perhaps not plausible, but maybe. Lydia was a miniature painter. She was probably the most skilled of all of the family in this art world. She went on to study with Whistler in Paris, and several of her artworks are in the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So she was really good, and maybe at the age of 11 she was able to draw this. I pointed out that the figures, the human figures, were a little rough in this, and I wonder maybe it's because she was still young and hadn't had a chance to go study in Paris. Just some speculation on my part. Okay, so what happened to Pine Grove Park, the amusement park? Well, it went into decline. It looks like by the 1898-99 picnic seasons, there were very few visitors by comparison to the early years. And we have a 1903 newspaper article from Gettysburg that says, "Pine Grove Park no more." Now this is at the end of 1903. "The vast mountain fires of the past summer and that before," so that's 1903 and 1902, "have wrought considerable damage to the once beautiful and popular Pine Grove Park. Now it is in a deplorable state. It has not been in use for several years, and before many months more, woodmen will have felled all the trees about the place, although they must not have cut all of them down." There was a very bad fire at the Laurel Lake area in the year 1900, and that may have accelerated the decline. So it seems reasonable to say that around 1900 or maybe 1901 is when the park stopped operating. Meanwhile, it was the end of an era in a different way. The artisanal charcoal iron industry was on its last legs. Montalto went out of business in 1893, and after a temporary shutdown for a couple of years, Pine Grove Furnace went out of business in 1895, so they were no longer making iron. Jackson Fuller lived on a few more years. He died in October of 1904 at the Ironmaster's Mansion, and just 6 months later, in February of 1905, Jay Cook died in Philadelphia. And at this point, everything ended. They started having very prolonged discussions about selling all of this to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It finally happened. Took a long time to make the arrangements, and by 1913, they had finished a series of land sales, and most of the 20-something thousand acres were now in the possession of the Commonwealth of PA. It was not originally called the Michaud State Forest. That's a later name. It was a forest reserve, and it was specifically the Pine Grove Division of the South Mountain Forest Reserve. The others were the Caledonia Iron Lands and the Montalto Iron Lands. It was only in the 1920s that they were merged to become one forest, the Michaud. At that time, in 1913, there was a lot of discussion, very optimistic, that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania would restore the old amusement park. And I wish they had. It would have been a very interesting experience if we had something like that. I mean, today they have a golf course down in Caledonia. Why not have an amusement park? But it didn't happen. This newspaper article is one of the handouts in the back of the room, and I welcome you to read it. It's full of excitement, and they're saying that the railroad, remember again, the railroad's key to all of this, that the railroad is interested, and there's a lot of talk. Nothing ever came of it. When the Commonwealth bought the property, the remnants of the iron furnace itself were in very bad shape. That building's gone. You can see here the Ironmaster's Mansion that thankfully survived, and the Paymasters is still there. But it was a brownfield, is what we call it today. It was horrible. And a lot of the focus of recreation for this newly acquired land went towards the Laurel Forge area, what's now Laurel Lake. That was the emphasis on car camping, and most activities were happening down 2 miles away at the other end of the modern state park. So that's the first chapter of the story, and in the next 15 minutes we're going to cover several others. This is almost all new material compared to the October presentation that Linda mentioned. Camp cells, and I did have a handout in the back of the room about this. Barbara Landis is the Society's specialist on this topic, and I'm treading on her turf. She's actually given talks here specifically on camp cells, so I'm just going to mention it briefly. This was a way for a select number of students, typically around 40 or 50 for a week at a time, and they would have the kids come out on the railroad. They used the railroad and stopped there, and in your handout there's a personal description from the 1913, one of the boys and also one of the girls. So they had a group of older boys, a group of younger boys, and a group of girls, 1 week each, came out to Camp Cells. It was so named to commemorate the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, whose name was Cato Cells, and he had just started his new job in 1913. It was clearly right exactly where the old Pine Grove Park was. The children, what I find particularly interesting is the children visited what was left of the iron industry. The village of Pine Grove Furnace still existed. When the state bought the place in 1913, there were roughly a dozen families, mostly of former iron workers, still living mostly around the furnace area, where some of those cabins are today. So the children would go, 10, 15-minute walk up the road, the chaperones, I guess. They would go to the store, they could pick up mail or send mail, and they played baseball quite a bit. And so you can read the descriptions in the handout. The interesting thing to me in this photograph, number one, we've got a very crude crossing of Mountain Creek. So the nice bridges from the old Pine Grove Park are gone. And the trees are fairly grown up. So if these were cut around 1903, as that newspaper said was going to happen, they've had a chance to grow up, or maybe some of them closer to the water weren't even cut at all. It doesn't appear that the big fire of 1900 reached quite all the way to the center of this amusement park. We also see in these photographs of the Indians' Camp Cell that there's a pavilion. And it's a little hard to be sure, but this appears to be the 60-foot pavilion. I think with a little photometric technique, one might be able to figure out how deep this was. There were at least 3 structures that survived from the old park. One of them was the 60 by 30 pavilion. And here's another image. It shows it a bit better, that pavilion. You could probably do some estimates of how deep that goes. Here's a few pictures of the girls' baseball team and of the boys' baseball team. And the personal account that is in your handout, one of these boys mentions that they played repeatedly baseball with the white boys at Pine Grove Village. So that's kind of interesting. So that's Camp Cells. And again, I'll let Barb Landis cover that as she does so well. The next chapter is a very brief one, the Boy Scouts. It turns out that the Boy Scouts of Harrisburg used the same spot for one summer season for about 6 weeks. As far as I can tell, they made no physical improvements. There were the pavilion, the 60-foot pavilion, and another couple of structures were still there, and they just camped there. And we know this because of a letter from 1921. This involved a Girl Scout representative coming to the area to find a place for a Girl Scout camp. And the letter from the Department of Forestry says the Boy Scouts are at that spot. They have the option to do it again in the summer of 1921, but basically we think they're likely to cancel. If they don't, the Girl Scouts can go find a different spot. And in particular, what they're looking at is next to Laurel Lake. Okay, so that's the Boy Scouts. But they did cancel, and it was open for the Girl Scouts to come in from 1921. And amazingly, there was a Girl Scout camp there active all the way through 1967. Much longer than I'd realized when I got into this whole chapter of history. So that's twice as long, almost exactly, as Old Pine Grove Park. It was really modest beginnings. I'll show you some photographs in a minute. They had tents. They had those very few remaining pavilions and so forth from the Old Pine Grove Park that the Indian School had also used. And then in the 1930s and 40s, they very heavily built on the place. Now, I've mentioned the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. Let me give an overview real fast. Here's where we've been talking about. Pine Grove Camp, or Camp Pine Grove, down close to this end of the modern state park, and Fuller Lake is there. So 1920, the Boy Scouts, and then starting in 1921, the Girl Scouts. There was also a Camp Rothrock from 1921 to 1927. That was the Chester County Boy Scouts. And that's pretty well documented. There's a number of photographs you can find online. They have a Boy Scout Council historian who's given me a lot of information. It's amazing that they came all the way from Chester County, but they did, and they were there for a few years. And then starting in 1927, the YMCA camp that we know today, Camp Thompson, basically subsumed what was Camp Rothrock. So that's pretty much the same area on the west side of Laurel Lake. Also, much less documentation about Camp Lyon. There is a road there today called Camp Lyon Road, and that apparently in the 1930s and 40s was used by the Mechanicsburg Boy Scouts at times, and also by other social groups. I don't even know who actually owned it. So there were a number of different scouting opportunities and formal camp arrangements in the area of Laurel Lake and then down closer to Fuller. So back to the Girl Scouts at Old Pine Grove Park. They had a formal arrangement with the Commonwealth. In 1921, the original lease was only 9.5 acres. In 1936, it was expanded, and they started doing it for 10-year leases at a time. And at the bottom here, I've got the original, this is a blueprint, you can't see it very well, but here's the 9.5 acres, and then the meets and bounds, the surveyor shows us the 24 acres starting in 1936. They were paying only $9.50 a year. It's a pretty good deal. It got even better. After 2 rounds of 10-year leases in 1956, the now Department of Forests and Waters enlarged it. They gave them 58 acres dedicated to the Girl Scouts. And they were only paying $1 a year. That's pretty good. And in the archives, fairly recent acquisition, these actual leases are there, and you can read it. It says $1 a year. Is that a typo? I guess not. However, in 1966, Maurice Goddard got involved. And if you know Maurice Goddard, he was a hard-nosed guy. He's the modern father of the state park system, of course. And the 10-year lease at that point that was signed jumped up to $177. Still a pretty good deal considering. And in the lease that's in the archives now, you can see Maurice Goddard's signature. He was a tough guy. He maybe wasn't too thrilled about all of these outside scouting groups having full control of state land. That's my suspicion. The first year, way back in 1921, they only had about 80 campers, but by the end, they were having many hundreds. There were about 575 campers annually in the later years of operation. Here's a postcard that was being sold on eBay a while back, and it's from 1923, and you can see that there's just a bunch of tents. And here's a 1930 postcard also being sold on eBay, and here's some fairly simple structures and tenting right along the edge of Mountain Creek. Now, in the recent acquisitions that were donated to the Society, there's this transcription of some handwritten notes. We don't know the actual author or exactly when they were written, but it's a very nice history, and I gave this to you as one of your handouts. It's on the back of one of the handouts. Everything I gave you, by the way, is double-sided, so if you finish one page, turn it over, okay? And a few interesting things. It mentions the two sites that were available, Pine Grove Park versus Laurel. It mentions that the tents and cots, when they first started in 1921, were loaned from the state arsenal. So that must have been pretty rough. This was military surplus. And it also mentions those surviving structures. So you can read that, it's kind of interesting. There's also, I found online, this wonderful 1929 pamphlet to instruct scouts what they should bring and telling them and their parents about what they were going to experience. And it's two-sided, and that's another one of the handouts. It's rather interesting reading. It mentions that the Girl Scouts are to board a bus at the Harrisburg railroad station. Now that's interesting because the railroad line in 1929 was still going right past the park. And in fact, later on, they mentioned that the camp can be reached by the Hunter's Run branch of the Reading Railroad, change in ownership over the years. So the railroad is still active, but they're sending the girls and I guess all of their luggage down by bus and not by railroad, even though they could have. It mentions an abandoned ore hole offers a splendid opportunity for swimming. What is that today? Fuller Lake, okay. And one detail I wanted to point out, it says church. There's a Catholic church at Carlisle. Now you may know that there is a St. Eleanor Regina Catholic chapel that's about a mile or so north of the Pine Grove Furnace State Park office. That was built in 1950. This is 1929. In the 1930s and 1940s, before the Catholic chapel was built there, Monsignor Schmidt had a summer cabin, and he would hold services for the summer colony in the 30s and 40s in the cabin, and then it got too crowded, and they finally got permission to build an actual church building. But in 1929, none of that was available, so the Catholic Girl Scouts had to go up to Carlisle. And there's a Protestant church, it says, 1929, 10 minutes walk from camp. What's that? That's the brick church that's still there and still in use. The Methodist Episcopal Church built by J. Cook in 1870, and that was a short walk. There are a number of great sketches of the layout of this place. This is the sort of thing I wish we had for the old Pine Grove Park, but at least we have it for the Girl Scout camp. And you can see here the church, that's that 1870 brick church. It shows different buildings, including, here's a swimming pool, we'll talk about that in a moment, dining hall for the Girl Scouts. That's the 60-foot pavilion, and it's still there, and it's exactly 60 feet long, right next to the pool on the other side of Mountain Creek. There are different neighborhoods, Wonderland, Fishing Village. This one's called Dixie. Now, I know we have at least a few Girl Scouts in the room who went there. Raise your hand if you attended this. Okay, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 of you, at least 5. Okay, great. Can you call out, do you remember which neighborhood of tents you went to, anybody? Linda, do you remember? No, okay. So they had different neighborhoods. Now this was a 1937 sketch, and it is just a small point. This says Dixie was the neighborhood here of tents or cabins. In 1962, there was a very similar sort of view, a little more formal, and now it's been changed, and it's called Skylark and the Glen. They're not calling it Dixie anymore, 1962. Interesting. So again, this sketch from 1962 shows us the swimming pool and the dining hall that was in use, kitchen, and the Carlisle House. Girl Scouts, what was the Carlisle House used for? I can't figure that out. It must have been some sort of social center. It was not the arts and crafts area because that was elsewhere up here. Anyone know? No? Okay. Think about it. If you figure it out, if you remember, let me know, because Carlisle House was apparently one of the surviving structures going all the way back to Old Pine Grove Park from the 19th century. Also among the recent acquisitions of the Society Archives is a really nice engineering drawing from 1952, and it's got some later notations on it. It's very large, and I know you can't see all the details, but it's a really beautiful document. And the significant thing for us as sort of an archaeologic perspective, it's an engineering drawing. So if you can start somewhere that we know exists and still there, like the swimming pool, and let me zoom in there. If we were to start at the swimming pool, and also the concrete foundation remains for the 60-foot pavilion, which was the dancing pavilion in the 19th century, the dining hall for the Girl Scouts, that's still there. Using that, we could now go and find the foundation, or the former foundation, of all of these other buildings. And I think that would be a great project for some Dickinson archaeology students. Somebody should do this. There's a lot of challenges, but you could combine the field work with the documentation and put a coherent story and actually tell us where things used to be. Now, the swimming pool, and I know I'm getting towards the end of the hour. The swimming pool was built in 1934. It was started apparently by the Civil Work Administration, which was a very short-lived jobs creation program under FDR's New Deal. The Civil Work Administration ended abruptly in March of 1934. It had only been in operation 5 months. It was succeeded by the WPA and other programs. And that one-page history you have has a footnote at the bottom. Whoever transcribed it commented about this. So the Civil Work Administration started the pool, and then it was finished by the Girl Scouts. And then some of the later construction in the 30s and early 40s was apparently done under the other job programs like WPA. And this is a wonderful picture. The pool itself is 90 feet by 40 feet. Okay, so it's not an Olympic pool, but it's pretty decent sized. In this image, which we think might be from the 1930s, obviously it's after 1934, but maybe from the late 30s, there's some, I guess, male swimming instructions in a canoe. The canoe is, going to be, 12 feet long or something? It's only, so they couldn't go very far. They must have been there for water safety. And you can see all the Girl Scouts lined up in their little bathing suits and caps, and I love the caps. Okay. In the background of this picture, you can see that 60-foot pavilion is there. And it's hard to see in the projection, but there's a metal ladder, and actually it's right here, and this young lady is sitting sort of in the middle of that ladder, and there's a gap in the wall that's a spillway. I'm going to show you a picture I just took just a few days ago. We're from the other direction. The pool is certainly still there. Here's that metal ladder, and here's one of the spillways that you can see in the previous picture. Okay. This is right off of the hiker-biker trail, and there is a little social trail, a little informal trail going about 20 yards to get over to it. And when you walk over to it today, you'll see something interesting. It's elevated. It's out of the floodplain of Mountain Creek. And in fact, with my wife, we were just there the other day, and we took some informal measurement. It's about 8 feet above the creek. Okay, that's great engineering. It stops the creek from flooding it and polluting it. But it raises an interesting question. How in the world did they get the water in there? Did they have a bucket brigade of little Girl Scouts? Well, okay, I see Linda's making a face, but you had some harsh things to say about that Girl Scout camp when we had the talk in October, and they made you do all sorts of things. What did you say about the water?
Cold.
It was cold. Everyone says that. It was really cold. Well, I'm going to show you 2 reasons the water was so cold. So we've got this elevated pool. How in the world did they fill it? If you go about 1,000 feet upstream, just about 1,000 feet, maybe 1,100, you're going to come to the junction of Tom's Run and Mountain Creek. This is where Tom's Run dumps in. So Fuller Lake is ahead, and downstream from there is where the Girl Scout camp is. There is a breached concrete dam. It's very low. The State Department of Environmental Protection says it was only 2 feet high. I think it was more about 3 feet, but it's very low. And it's still in their records. And they still have, in 2012, I had a chance to go through the archives in Harrisburg, and it says the Harrisburg Council of Girl Scouts Dam 21-169 is still on their computer records. Of course, it's breached, it doesn't serve a function now, but it must have supplied the pool, at least in the beginning of 1934. And to prove this point, I've been meaning to do this for years. Just this past weekend, I did something. I used a GPS, a handheld gizmo, and I went and measured it. 833 feet is the top of the dam there. Does anyone want to guess what the swimming pool was? 826. Same device, just a few minutes apart. So that, guess what? Water flows downhill. So it went from the dam into the pool. It must have. And that's why the Girl Scouts had that little low dam there. It's the only reason I can imagine. So that was pretty cold because Mountain Creek, now this is 1930s. At some point, apparently in the 1940s, I guess that's when you all would have been there, they put in a pipe off a mountain spring to supply pool water and also drinking water. This is on the 1952 engineering drawing, but from other data, we can say it was installed in the 1940s by WPA, probably right around 1940. Now, I had never done this before until just the past weekend. If you go to the other side of the hiker-biker trail, the state park has a swamp trail. It's a very short loop. And it's, of course, swampy. But if you go to the back edge of it, there's a hillside. And if you go back in there, to my enormous pleasure, I found a pretty good source of water coming right off of the mountain. That's pretty common in the South Mountains. We see that. But this one is exactly where it should be. So I'm going to show you again the engineering drawing. And this little spring is this. It's tilted, it's not in good shape, but it's there, exactly where it should be. And there's even the remnants of some of the piping that led from that across to the pool and then across Mountain Creek and into the camp itself. And I was delighted. It's so much fun when you're doing this kind of, fast archaeology to find things that you haven't seen before. I don't know how many people have seen this, but it's still there. The donation fairly recently to the archives here includes all sorts of engineering drawings. Here are some upgrades that we're doing to the 60-foot pavilion. They were adding a little bit, and they were going to repair the roof, I guess. This is in the 1940s. Here's a sample Girl Scout cabin from, I can't say the year from where I am, was it? 34, okay. And the Girl Scouts in the room, were you in tents or were you in cabins like this? You were still in tents, okay. Looking at some of the sketching from 1937 and 1960s or 1950s sketches, it does look like there were both tents and cabins there, so maybe you were just unlucky, I don't know. But they had some standard protocol for cabins. We also have some nice drawings, engineering, architectural drawings for a building called the Health Cabin or Tall Trees. And here's a photograph from the newspaper so we can correlate the porch and so forth with an actual photograph. Here's other newspaper pictures of other buildings. And bringing it back around to Old Pine Grove Park. This is a real treasure. Someone, I'm guessing it was one of the older Girl Scouts, created a kind of a treasure hunt or just a self-guided tour maybe. And there's about a dozen of these, and we now have the originals in the archives here, donated just a few months ago. And they say where you're standing now used to be something else in the old days. And in particular, this one says, this is number 8, I think it is. It says, go off from wherever you are to the Skylark Cabin. And when you get to the next one, number 9, so this would have been posted, physically some tens of yards away at least. You arrive there and you've got the next one and the next one. Well, the next one, number 9, says that behind this area was the old bicycle track from the old Pine Grove Park. I know from other documentation that the wooden track, or remnants of it at least, were still visible at least through the 1950s. Okay, that was in a newspaper article that someone was remembering. So that maybe allows us to combine the drawings and maps from the Girl Scout camp as a tool to help us reach back through the decades and reach all the way back to the old Pine Grove Park. Also donated were some wonderful pictures. There's a number of these of Girl Scouts doing things. And Linda, where are you? Raise your hand. There's Linda. Thank you, Linda. That's Linda right there. Anyone else, just by chance? Are any of the other Girl Scouts here in this picture? No? And Linda, you thought this was probably the 1950s, I guess. Is that right?
Late 40s, around 50.
Okay, wonderful. So compare this to the photograph I showed you that was maybe by John Choate from Old Pine Grove Park with those ladies in the heavy Victorian dresses. These girls are smiling. They look like they're having fun. Of course, conventions have changed in half a century from when Choate's pictures were taken. Here's other pictures. There's a lot of these also in the newspapers you can find online of activities, crafts, and so forth. And I don't know what building this was, maybe the craft area, but anyhow, you've got girls doing something. Everyone looks pretty happy, despite all the complaints I've been hearing about cold water and peeling potatoes and things. So what happened to end the story? The Girl Scout camp closed after the 1967 summer season. It appears from the stuff that was donated to the society that by 1960 they were starting to look for a new place. They were considering whether they could move some of the buildings. I believe they ended up looking north of Harrisburg in the, I want to say the McCormick Valley, is that right? Anyhow, I think they went into northern Dauphin County. Also, there's a letter from this period in the 1960s mentioning that the health department had concerns over water quality. Now, we're not talking about the quality of the water flowing from the spring getting to the camp, not the drinking water in the pool, but the effluent. And this is not a comment directed only at the Girl Scout camp. There's other Boy Scout camps, there were all these cabins, and the water quality of Mountain Creek and Laurel Lake, and even upstream at Fuller, was starting to have problems. There were coliform counts, and so the health department was a bit concerned about all this development. So it ended up that after 1967, they closed. With agreement from Maurice Goddard's side of the fence, they closed it down. And they made a pretty good deal. They got $15,750 for all the buildings and improvements they'd installed since the 1930s. Now, this is from a newsletter from the Hemlock Girl Scout Council in '67 saying it's closing. And the article in this newsletter says the government plans remedial programs for the entire area before opening it up for camping. As best I can tell, the remedial program consisted of knocking everything down. Maybe they removed some of the buildings and used them elsewhere, I do not know. I'd love to have a little more detail about what happened after 1967, but I can find no record of a formal camping area or of any of those buildings being used for public purposes. So after 1967, everything's just wiped away. The pool must have been filled in, because as you saw, it's filled in with dirt today. That's what it looks like. There's so much barberry there today that you can barely tell that it's 100 feet long, or 90 feet on the interior. It's overgrown, it's really sad. Some other pictures of what it looks like today from the swimming pool. If you look across Mountain Creek, there's a concrete foundation, and I have measured this, and it is exactly 60 feet long and 30 feet across. It's parallel to the creek, exactly the way that is shown on the earlier drawings and some of the photos, even going back to Camp Sells. That must have been the original location of the dance pavilion from Old Pine Grove Park. There's another foundation that's 28 by 16, I think, a little bit downstream. I don't know where the Carlisle house was, because we're told that had survived into the Girl Scout era. If you walk back into the woods, I went looking for the Skylark and the Glen area. I found roughly where it must be a series of posts. There's quite a few of these stretched out in a line. They're not for a foundation of a building. They weren't holding up a porch because of their spacing. And looking at the details, you see, for example, this ring here. I think it's possible that those posts represented the edge of the bicycle racetrack, but I don't know that. That's going to need some more work, a little bit of digging. Maybe we'll still find some traces of that wooden track, although it's probably rotted away, who knows. So I think that's a great topic for an archaeology class project or something. Also in the general area, you can find foundations. This is probably one of the latrines. I moved a bunch of barberry off of it, and you're looking at the remnant soil. There were 2 to 3 inches of dirt forming. This is how nature reclaims everything that people do after only, it's from 1967, so only 50 years, not even. It's all getting swallowed up. There are other foundations scattered through the area. I really don't know what this one is. Most of it is just like this. It's trees, it's barberry everywhere, it's ferns, so even if there aren't invasives, the ferns are sort of blocking your view of the dirt underneath. So it's going to be a real challenge to find those foundations, but a lot of them are still there, and I think we should go find them. So on that note, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to have questions or comments.